Hey everyone. So I'm going to go over the lesson on drafting research papers. This is hopefully going to be a very helpful lesson. This seems to be the part of the whole process where students start to struggle the most. You know, you pick your topic in project part 1 and you free write about it, and you answer some questions about it, and hopefully you've chosen a topic that you are truly interested in, that you are passionate about, and that truly interests you. So then when you get to project part 2 and you are looking for sources and you're doing the research, that step, while it can be time consuming, doesn't seem to be as troublesome for students either, because they don't mind really doing the research because it's a topic they're interested in. And even though it can be tough to find the time to do the research, actually reading your sources and learning about the topic, students don't seem to struggle with that quite as much. But then they get to project part 3, where it's time to actually write the rough draft, and then things start to become more difficult. Students have a harder time taking everything that they've done so far and figuring out how to put it all in an essay that is organized and stays on topic and doesn't go off track, that is well developed, and then on top of that adheres to APA format guidelines in terms of the design of the paper and then how you're citing your sources. Then there's the added pressure of making sure that you are incorporating the source material in a proper way. And I don't mean just the citation, I mean actually getting that information into a paragraph. So that's what we're focusing on this week. So this lesson, drafting research papers, takes you, through the whole process. Where do we go once we have project part 2 completed? How do we get to a full rough draft? The next lesson this week is on using sources, integrating sources. So that lesson will look more closely at how do you use summary? How do you use paraphrase? How do you create a proper paraphrase that doesn't run the risk of being plagiarism? How do you use a direct quote? When do you use a direct quote? How do you integrate that quote so that you aren't plunking a quote? That's what the next lesson will cover. So I'm hoping that with these 2 lessons here in week 5, you will have a more confident outlook on completing project part 3 next week in week 6. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the PowerPoint here. Okay, so we're going from researching to writing. Again, project part 1 and project part 2, while they can be time consuming, they don't necessarily require a ton of technical writing skills. But now we have to take everything we've done so far and create an actual draft of the essay. So where do we start? The first thing you want to do is review your findings, which means looking back at project part 1 and project part 2 and looking at what you answered for both of those project parts. Also looking at my feedback from those project parts, and then thinking about any changes that you have already made, any changes that I suggested, any changes that you have come up with just because you've continued reading about your topic or you've continued thinking about your topic. So we need to review what we have so far first. So the first step while you're reviewing your findings is to go back to project part 2 and look at the main points you listed in project part 2, because I asked you to do that. At that stage, what did you envision your main points being? So for example, if you chose the topic, what are the causes of nursing burnout? What 3 specific causes did you plan on focusing on when you completed project part 2? Okay. Are your main points going to stay the same? And it's very possible they will, right? Or did your continued research and thinking generate new or different or additional main points? Did my feedback prompt you to change anything about your main points? That's the first thing you need to do. You need to decide if anything has changed in terms of those main points. Then, can you discuss each main point in your own words without looking at any sources? So if you have 3 causes of nursing burnout listed, can you talk about each one of those causes without looking at any of your sources? Do you understand each of your main points enough that you can have a discussion about each one of them? If the answer is yes, great. You're in a good place. If the answer is no, you need to rethink any main point that you do not fully understand, that you cannot talk about on your own without looking at your sources. Either read more about that main point or main points, there might be more than one. Read more about it so that you do develop a better understanding of it on your own. Or remove that main point, right? You only want to include main points that you fully understand and that you can discuss out loud without having to look at any of your source material. Then, once you've gone through, those steps, make a final decision. Which specific main points would you focus on in the paper? Write them down. Make a note of it so that you know for sure these are the ones that I'm going to focus on. I can talk about each one of them on my own without looking at any kind of source material. I understand each one fully. Okay? Got your main points in place. Move on to step 2, which is to look at your sources from project part 2, right? Ask yourself, do I have some type of source material for each main point? Right? Now, that could be any type of source material that is acceptable and credible. So journal articles, a credible website, interviews that you have done, like discussions that you've had with your coworkers or your superiors or your classmates, right? I don't mean to say that every single main point has to have like a traditional academic source, but there has to be something that you're using within each main point that is more than just your own ideas. It needs to be mostly your own ideas, but remember, you need sources to help make your writing more credible, to show that your ideas are valid, right? So do you have some type of source material for each main point? Yes? Great. No? Find more. Remember, you have to have at least 3. That's the bare minimum. If you have 3 main points, then you're probably covered. But maybe you have 4 main points. And if you only have 3 sources, then you're running the risk of not having source support for that 4th main point. It's possible that one of your sources could cover your 1st main point and your 4th main point, and that's fine. You still have 3 sources total in the paper. So there's some room to, maneuver, but do you have source information for each main point? If not, find some, right? Once you have the sources you need, then move on to the next question. Do you know exactly what you will use from each source? Right? Because let's say you got a journal article. That's a lot of information. What exactly are you going to use from that source? Which part of that article are you going to pull information from to use in your essay? Is that information relevant? Does that information truly help support an idea that you are developing in that main point? A lot of students will just throw in a random sentence or two from their source. And I read the source and I'm like, why would they pick that when there's all this other useful information, way more relevant than what they included? It's almost like they just picked the easiest idea that was presented in the source and used that in their paper just to count as a source use, because they have to use 3 sources. They're not really thinking about, how is this source actually helping me? What part of this source is giving me information that helps develop and support the idea that I'm presenting? Use the source effectively. Have you done that? Yes? Great. No? Then find a more relevant piece of information from that source, or find a new source for that main point. Once you're confident that you know every source you're going to use in the paper and what exactly you're going to use from each source, ask yourself this: do I have a correct reference entry for every source? Yes? Great. If you're using any of the sources still that you listed in project part 2, you should be able to answer yes to that question, because you were required to put it in a reference entry in proper APA format. And if it wasn't in proper APA format, then you had to fix it. But you may have added more sources since then, right? So you have to make sure you get a correct reference entry for any new source you've added, right? If you don't, stop and do this now. Get that reference entry created so that you are ready to create a references page here in just a little bit, right? So make sure you have a correct reference entry for every source you're using in the paper now at this stage. Do you know how you will incorporate each piece of source information? So you're looking at source number 1, you understand the source, you've read it, you know exactly what part of the source you're going to be using. It is relevant, it's going to really help support your idea. You have a correct reference entry for that source. But how are you going to incorporate that information? Are you going to summarize it? Are you going to paraphrase it? Or are you going to provide a direct quote? Now, as you're watching this video, you may not have an answer to that yet, and that is fine. We are going to look very closely at summary, paraphrasing, direct quote in the next lesson. So once you get through these lessons here in week 5, this will be easier to answer, right? But here in this step of reviewing your findings, this is one thing you need to think about. Am I going to use summary? Am I going to use paraphrase? Or am I going to use direct quote? Looking at each specific source, right? Then we move on to step 3, right? So you have your main points nailed down. You have your sources nailed down. You know exactly how you're going to use each one of them. Step 3 is going back to your working thesis statement from project part 2. Does your working thesis statement still include every main point that you will discuss in the essay? If it does, great. If it doesn't, work on this. Look back at the main points you decided on in step 1 here, right? Step 1. And then revise your working thesis statement accordingly. Because your thesis statement in the essay needs to mention every single main point that you will cover in the body of the essay. Does your working thesis statement utilize rich, clear terms? You want to avoid vague, broad, or inappropriate terms. You want to replace those with solid nouns and adjectives and adverbs and concepts. You want specifics. You want words that have rich meaning, instead of saying something, replace that with a word that means more than that. Does your working thesis statement require any kind of qualifying terms? We want to avoid absolute terms. You don't want to use terms like all, always, or never that are like all, or never. You want to use terms that are like, normally or often or usually, right? Having qualifying terms helps make your thesis statement more reasonable and acceptable. Because when a reader looks at a thesis statement that is using absolute terms, like such as like low pay will always cause nursing burnout. No, it will not always. Will it often? Yes. Right? So you want to use qualifying terms so that your ideas are more reasonable and easily accepted. It sounds like it's weakening your statement, but it's not. It's making you seem more reasonable. Like you are, you feel like low pay is often a cause of nursing burnout, but you are open to the possibility that it will not always be a cause, right? But in this particular paper, you think that low pay is a strong enough cause that you are going to include it and discuss it, right? Okay, now let's think about that thesis statement a little more because it's worth a lot of points, and it is the door that opens the rest of the essay, and it's the reader's last chance to decide if they want to walk through that door. So you want to give them as much specific information as possible, but without the full sentence being very wordy and awkward. Okay, so going back to sharpening it though, and making sure that it is as laser focused as possible, we have a thesis statement here that starts off with, in a version that isn't awful, but it's just not focused enough. We have Batman's personality is more complex than Superman. Okay, Batman, Superman, complex personalities. Like, I at least have some idea of what this essay is going to be about. But I'm still thinking to myself, like, that I still really don't know, because there's so many possibilities. Because are we talking about every version of Batman and Superman? Is this essay really going to talk about all of the comic book versions? Is it going to talk about the cartoon versions and the movie versions? That's a lot, right? So as an author, I have to ask myself, am I really looking at every single version, or what have I decided to focus on? Well, it turns out I actually focused on the early editions of the comics. That's where I was really focusing most of my attention when I was looking at the personalities of these two characters. So let's revise the thesis statement so that it makes that clear to the reader. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Batman's personality is more complex than Superman. Okay, now my reader knows we're not even going to touch the later comics. We're not even going to touch the cartoons. We're not even going to touch any of the movies. Only the early editions of the comics. So my reader is a little more prepared now, right? But, Batman and Superman, each of those also has an alter ego, right? Batman is Bruce Wayne, Superman is Clark Kent. Am I going to be talking about every version of this character? No, I know that I'm not even looking at Batman and Superman. I used those words in my thesis statement because they're even more recognizable than Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent. And the comics, every show, every movie uses the superhero name. We don't have a lot of things out there that are widely known that in the title refer to them by their alter ego names. So I used Batman and Superman in my original thesis statement because I felt like that's what readers would, understand better. But I can still name the titles, but make it clear that I'm only focusing on the alter egos, right? So in the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne's personality is more complex than Clark Kent's. Now, I've made it clear that I'm focusing on the early editions of these comics. I've used the name Batman and the name Superman so readers understand exactly, what world I'm in. But I've also made it clear that I'm focusing on just their, average, ordinary guy personas, Bruce Wayne, Clark Kent. So we're in better shape. But what in the heck do I mean by Bruce Wayne's personality is more complex? Personality is a very vague term. Complex is a very vague term because they can mean so many different things, right? Personality is made up of so many different facets. Am I really going to discuss every single aspect of their personality? Complex could mean anything. What do I even mean by that? When I'm thinking about these two men, what is it about Bruce Wayne that is so different from Clark Kent? Well, it turns out that I'm actually looking at how Bruce Wayne is, a real glass half empty kind of guy, right? Doesn't really often see the bright side of things. Clark Kent is way more glass half full, right? He is, the romantic optimist in a lot of ways. So that's really what I'm talking about. That's really where this essay is going to lead us. So I need to make that clear. So here's my final version. In the early editions of Batman and Superman comics, Bruce Wayne is more pessimistic than Clark Kent. Look at how far we came from that original working thesis statement. We got it to a place where now our reader knows exactly what's coming in the essay. We're not looking at anything else. This essay is focused only on how Bruce Wayne is more pessimistic than Clark Kent in the early editions of these comics. You need to try to do something similar with your thesis statement if it is not as clear and focused as it needs to be. If you have a topic like the causes or effects of nursing burnout, you should have an easier time of creating a focused thesis statement because your topic lends itself to specific types of main points, causes. But you still have to make sure that you word the thesis statement in a way that the causes you have chosen to focus on are there, or the effects you've chosen to focus on. If you have decided on the topic, if you chose the topic on what are the, or does inadequate nurse staffing put patients at risk? Your thesis statement needs to be worded in such a way that it's clear that we're talking about staffing issues and how those create risk for the patients and which specific risks you are going to focus on in this essay. If you have chosen what is music therapy and how does it work, you had a lot more to sort of figure out in terms of specifics. What is music therapy? How does it work? You had to decide based on your own experience, your own ideas, your own research, what you were going to include in your essay. Are you going to look at, you know, music therapy is an alternative type of treatment that can be helpful with dementia patients, people on the autism spectrum, and people in drug and alcohol rehab. Maybe you chose to look at how it helps dementia patients only. So the whole essay is going to just focus on that one particular setting. And you're going to look at it helps dementia patients in this way. It helps them in another way. And it helps them in a third way, right? You had a lot, your topic was way more open to interpretation in terms of where you were going to focus your topic. Whatever you decided to do, it needs to be crystal clear in the thesis statement. Okay. All right, so we have some other examples of strong thesis statements here. Whenever teenagers marry, they face 3 serious problems that threaten their happiness. It's pretty good. We know it's focused on teenagers getting married. We know it's going to focus on 3 problems that threaten their happiness. This would have been even better if they had listed those 3 problems in the thesis statement. I need to know, what are the 3 problems? I need to know that right away. Prize fighting is a dangerous sport that should be banned in the United States. Okay, prize fighting, dangerous, banned in the United States. We're very focused. Would have been even better if the reasons had been listed. Or soap operas are popular because they entertain, inform, and help to fulfill the viewer's emotional needs. That is a very strong, focused, specific list of main points in that thesis statement. That is the best version out of the 3 here on this slide. Right? These 2 aren't bad, and they'd be really easy to adjust so that they are just as strong as this one. All you got to do is add in those main points, add in the reasons, right? But this one is where you want to try to be, right? We also have, 2 paragraphs here that asking you to identify the thesis statement. But I'll tell you, these come from the lesson in week 2 that you've already looked at. So, don't forget that you can go back to the lessons in week 2 and get a refresher on what a strong thesis statement needs to look like, right? You got feedback from me on your working thesis statement in project part 2, so don't forget to look back at what I said as well, to see if it will, give you a good idea of whether, how close that working thesis statement was in project part 2. All right. So once you have nailed down your main points, nailed down your sources, and revised your working thesis statement if needed, it's time to start thinking about getting ready to actually write the essay. Okay. First, let's look at 2 things you do not want to do as you draft. The first is do not create a high school hamburger. This essay is supposed to be, 3, 4, maybe 5 pages long, not including the title page and references page. That's, 3, 4 pages of just essay, introductory paragraph to concluding paragraph. So you cannot do a simple 5-paragraph essay. This is a college level paper. Each main point should be fully developed enough that most, if not all of them, will require more than 1 paragraph to explain thoroughly. Remember, you change to a new paragraph when you switch the focus of the topic. I could have 3 main points, but let's say my first main point is on, let's see, going back to causes of burnout. Let's say one of the causes that I included was staffing issues. There is so much to say about staffing issues and how that can lead to burnout. So you're not going to want to try to put all of that information in one paragraph, because 2 things are going to happen. Either trying to fit it all in one paragraph means you have a paragraph that takes up 2 pages of your document because you just kept going and going and going. There's so much to say. Or you have a paragraph that is normal sized, but does not fully explain how staffing issues can lead to burnout. If you are on the shorter side, that means you need to develop that idea more. You need to explain more. If you're on the longer side, you have probably developed that main point really well. Now you just got to break it up into paragraphs. Just because it's one main point doesn't mean it should all be in one paragraph. A main point can take up multiple paragraphs to fully explain it. Okay? So, no high school hamburger. Second thing you want to avoid is information regurgitation. Do not simply repeat source information. Every time you use information from a source, you need to analyze it, explain it, synthesize it. It needs to be followed up on, and we will cover this more in the next lesson, integrating sources. But it should not be just, your paper shouldn't be just a series of source summaries. You're not doing a literature review, right? You are putting forth your own ideas and using the source material very sparingly. So the majority of each paragraph in your essay should be your ideas and words. Remember, 80% of the whole paper should come from your own ideas and words, with only 20% or less coming from source material. And that's the percentage, that's the ratio for the whole essay, but it's kind of a good guideline to use for each paragraph as well. Each paragraph, 80% your own ideas, only 20% from your sources. If you look at, so if you treat each paragraph with that same concept, that same ratio in mind, you're going to make sure that it's not just information regurgitation. You're going to make sure that each paragraph puts forth your own ideas, and that you have developed your own ideas, and that the source material is only there to help support your own ideas. Right? Okay. All right. Now it's time to decide what is our plan of attack for this draft. You have to choose a drafting method first. All right, and there's 2. Well, 2 that we're going to discuss in this lesson. The first method is writing freely. This is probably what most students do, except they leave out a step that could be super helpful. But basically what you do with this method is you review your working thesis statement and all of your notes, everything that you've compiled. You review them, and then you set them aside. And then you start writing. You write, start from the beginning, get it all out. This drafting process will not include any source material, because you've set everything aside and you're just going to write from start to finish, right? I think this is what a lot of students do. Maybe they have their sources, though, that they're trying to put in at the same time, and that causes some problems. So if you're going to write freely, there's I think there's two things you need to do. First is truly put your source material away for a while. This will help ensure that this version of the draft, this first version, is completely your own ideas. It's based 100% on your ideas and words because you're not looking at any of your sources to put into the essay yet. And this is super helpful because a lot of students struggle with making sure that they are not overusing source material, right? Once you get it finished from start, introductory paragraph to concluding paragraph, then you go back and look at your notes, look at the information from your sources, and figure out where and how to incorporate those sources. This is a great method to use if you are worried about making sure that the essay is at least 80% your own ideas and words. Okay. Having said that, if you simply review your notes and your working thesis statement and then set everything aside and sit down to write the essay from start to finish, and then try to go back and put in your source material, you run the risk of the essay, this version of the essay not being very well organized, which is why I think this is the step that students probably skip, and they need to make sure they do it, which is, review your working thesis statement and notes, yes, but then before you sit down and start writing, create a brief scratch outline. So what do we mean by that? Okay, just a little scratch outline, right? It's not going to have a whole lot of detailed information on it. Just some ideas jotted down in a structured form to help keep you on track. So, you got to start with your introduction. You're going to introduce the topic in some way. You're going to use an attention-grabbing technique and then tell us about your topic. And you know that your introductory paragraph needs to end with your working thesis statement. You already know what that is, so let's go ahead and type it out here on the outline. This thesis statement is, because of their income deficit and general susceptibility to depression, students who drop out of high school maintain a higher risk for physical and mental health problems later in life. Right? So, income deficit, general susceptibility to depression. Students who drop out of high school are at higher risk of physical and mental health problems later in life. Okay. I know that I'm going to need to give some background information, so that's the next part of my essay. I'm going to have to talk about, historical employment and historical healthcare. I know what I mean by that, so I'll know what I want to say about those ideas. I know I'm also going to have to talk about the link between education and employment type. I understand that enough already. This will be enough of a reminder for me that I need to talk about these things in this background section. Then I know my first main point is going to be employment conditions and physical health. I know in that section, I'm going to have a main idea about injuries and then another one about recovery time. Main point number 2, employment conditions and mental health. I know I'm going to have to talk about levels of stress, and I know I want to talk about how stress is linked to mental health issues. My third main point is physical health and mental health linked. I'm going to show how they are linked, how both are connected, and how stress can manifest in physical ways. My fourth main point is going to be financial worries leading to more stress and poor physical health, how dropping out can lead to financial issues, and how financial issues are linked to other problems that affect mental and physical health. And I know in my conclusion, I'm going to have to restate my thesis statement in some way, refer back to that thesis statement, and I'm going to, I know I want to talk at the end about, what comes next. How do we address this problem? Right? I know my ideas well enough. I understand each of these sections well enough that all I needed to do was just give myself these little reminders. But it's good to have this outline with these little reminders so that when I sit down to start writing, I can look back and make sure, when I'm writing the section with background information, I can look and make sure that I have talked about both of these ideas. I have employment conditions and physical health as my first main point, employment conditions and mental health as my second main point. I can look back at this little outline as I'm writing to make sure I did them in the right order, because they're so similar. I could have easily mixed them up as I was writing, but I've already decided I want to talk about physical health first, and then I want to talk about mental health. So as I'm writing the draft, I'm going to look back at this little outline and make sure I've gone in the correct order. In this section about physical health, I'm going to look at the outline and make sure I've talked about injuries and make sure I've talked about recovery time. I keep coming back to this little scratch outline with these little reminders just to make sure I'm staying on track as I write the essay. That is a scratch outline, not a ton of detailed information, just little reminders of how I want it organized and what general ideas I need to discuss in each section. All right. Again, using this method means that you have to go back afterwards and add in the source material. And I know that seems like, why would I choose a drafting method that requires 2 steps? Why wouldn't I just include all of the source material the first time around? Again, this drafting method is helpful because you are expected to make sure that the majority of your essay is grounded in your own ideas and words. I want this to be you. You have to use at least 3 sources to show me that you can, to show me that you know how. But I want the paper itself to be mostly you. This drafting method will help you do that. And yes, it's a little more time that you then have to spend going back to your sources and putting them in the appropriate spots in the essay, but it's going to save you time down the road more than likely, because if you don't have enough of yourself, if you have used your sources too much, you're going to get feedback from me on your rough draft, and it's basically going to say, you got to redo this whole thing, and you got to make sure that it's mostly you. You're using your sources too much. And then you have to sit down and write basically a brand new rough draft anyway, using your sources more minimally. So why not do it that way the first time? Because then you'll get your rough draft back from me and I'll be like, this is great. Your voice comes through loud and clear. You have used your sources minimally, but very effectively. You're in a good place. So if you take the time to do it this way now, it's less revision you have to do in a week or 2 from now. However, there are some students who are a little better, a little more experienced at, making sure that the paper is grounded in their own ideas. And I also think that certain topics on that list in project part 1, lend themselves a little better to making sure that it's, more your voice and minimal sources, especially the topics that you guys have a lot of personal experience with. So burnout, staffing issues, putting patients at risk, those 2 in particular, I think students have a little bit of an easier time grounding the essay in their own voice. Things like music therapy and art therapy, you may have an interest in them, but if you don't have a lot of experience with it, then it can be tougher to not rely on your sources too much. For whatever the reason might be, some students have a little easier time making sure that the paper is more them with a minimal use of sources, in which case they can write systematically. I still suggest an outline for this, but essentially what you're doing is what you probably thought you should do when we were looking at the previous method, which is to write the draft from start to finish and incorporate the source material then the first time as you're writing it, instead of writing the whole thing, then going back and adding in your sources. Writing systematically is writing the whole thing with your sources the first time around. Okay, but I still suggest an outline. So let's look at what an outline appears like when you're writing systematically, when you're gonna include your source material the first time around, right? My introductory paragraph, I am going to start off talking about our current problem, that educational attainment rates are decreasing in the United States while healthcare costs are increasing. I'm going to mention the population and area of focus. I'm going to be looking at unskilled or low-skilled adult workers. And then here's my thesis statement again, right? Because of their income deficit and general susceptibility to depression, students who drop out of high school before graduation maintain a higher risk for physical and mental health problems later in life, right? I know my first section after my intro is going to be a little bit of background information that my reader needs. Historical employment overview. Right? I'm going to talk about unskilled laborers in the past, how they were frequently unionized and adequately compensated for their work. And I'm going to make a note of any source that I'm going to use here for this idea. And if I am going to use a source for this idea, then here on this line, I am going to type out exactly what I'm going to use from that source, right? Maybe even include the citation, because if I've gone through the steps that we've covered in the beginning of this lesson, I have a reference entry for every single source I'm going to use. So I can go ahead and put the citation here on this line of my outline so that I have it right there as I'm drafting. I keep looking back at my outline. Okay, I'm in the section on background information and I'm writing about this idea of historical employment overview. I'm looking at how workers used to be unionized and adequately compensated. Oh yeah, that's right. Looking at my outline, I know this is the source I'm going to use. And looking at my outline, this is the specific information I'm going to take from that source. And there's my citation. Right. Second part of my background information section is historical healthcare overview. I'm going to be talking about how unskilled laborers in the past were often provided adequate healthcare and benefits. If I'm using a source here, this is the source I'm going to use. This is the information from that source, and I would include the citation, right? You can see as you go through, this outline is much more detailed, right? Before we just had background and like 2 ideas listed. This one goes into way more detail. So it helps you as you draft. It's almost like it tricks your brain, but you have all of this information, second main point, first main idea is, you can see how much information is being put on this outline compared to the scratch outline, right? This outline is 6 pages long. The scratch outline all fit on 1 page. So again, it seems like a lot of work, to create a 6-page outline, but think about how helpful it would be. And going back to how I said it can kind of trick your brain. A lot of us, especially if we have any kind of anxiety about, writing a full essay, we start the process and sometimes we just hit a wall. We're staring at the blank screen, or we have a paragraph typed and then we're just stuck. Or we do keep writing, but then who knows if we've stayed on track. Our thoughts are everywhere. We can't stay focused. We're so afraid of, going into too much detail. And at the same time, we're too afraid of not giving enough detail, that it can just make us sort of seize up a little bit. But if you can create a detailed outline like this, it makes you think that you're not writing the essay. Like, okay, I'm not writing the essay yet. This is just an outline. I can do this. I can, put how I want to start my intro. I can put, any information that's needed in the intro. I can put my thesis statement. I know I'm going to need to cover some background information before I get into my main points. And I know my background information is going to need to provide a historical employment overview, especially about unions and how they were compensated. I know it's going to have to talk about a historical healthcare overview, how they were given adequate healthcare benefits. I know I'm going to need to, in that background section, I'm going to have to talk about the link between education and employment type. And I know I'm going to have to talk about gaps in the research. Right? Then I can move on to my first main point. I know I want my first main point to be the conditions of employment and how they affect their workers' physical health. Right? I know I'm going to talk about how unskilled work environments are correlated highly with worker injury. I know this is the source I want to use, and this is the information from that source. I know I also need to talk about how unskilled work environments rarely provide healthcare or adequate injury recovery time. And that's the source I'm going to use, and this is the information from that source. I know my second main point is going to be this. I need to talk about this idea, and I'll use this source, and I also need to talk about this idea, and I'll use this source. It allows us to shut off the part of our brain that's like, I have to write an essay. I'm writing an essay. I don't know how to write an essay. Writing an essay makes me nervous. This is just organizing your ideas. But look how easy it would be when you sit down to type if you have all of these details included on your outline. Then you just sort of fill it out. The essay is almost written for you if you use a detailed outline. And you might think to yourself, why would, if I'm basically putting so much information into this outline, how is that, why wouldn't I just write the essay? Yeah, if your brain works that way, and you can envision the structure and then just write it, that's great. But very few people can do that successfully, right? We need to have the structure visually available to us so that we can actually write it and stay on track. And the more information you give yourself on your detailed outline, the easier the draft is. So I highly suggest this version if you're not worried about overusing your sources. This is a great method. But again, if you are worried that you might use too much source information, I suggest the writing freely method so that you get a version of your draft where you didn't even look at your sources. And then you go in and incorporate the sources minimally. So you have two options. I would carefully consider which one would serve you best for this particular paper. And it's very possible, that you get an assignment and you're like, oh, I just need a little scratch outline and I can include my source information as I go. I'm good. Other assignments, you'll get the essay, you'll write an essay and it'll be like, okay, I really need to just give myself a scratch outline and write the whole thing first and then go back and add in sources, because I'm having a tough time making sure I understand my own ideas, making sure they're present in the paper. And sometimes the systematic detailed outline method will work for you. So, I'm not saying that you have to decide right now, okay, am I a person who uses the first method every single time I write a paper? Or am I the type of person that uses the second method every single time. It might not be the same every single time, but before you sit down and start typing your introductory paragraph for that particular assignment, choose one of these methods that will work best for you in that specific situation and then follow through on it. The way you follow through on it is create the outline. It is the most useful tool to help make sure that you include all the ideas you planned to include and that you discuss them in the order you decided upon, that you stick to your plan. That's really what an outline is. It is your plan that you're going to follow as you draft, and you can continually refer to that plan to ensure you're sticking to it. Such a useful tool. All right. So now it's time to sit down and actually write the essay. So don't forget that, it's still an essay. So you have to make sure you have all of those basic essay elements, right? It is an APA format. So you need to make sure you have all of those required elements in place. That is where I would start. I would start with APA format. So you open up your new document, and first thing you do, set up your header. Go up into the header and insert page numbers. Make sure you've got them on the right-hand side of your header, right top corner. Title page should be number 1. All you get is just the number 1, and then on the next page, 2 is in the header, and then 3, that's it. Set that up first. Then set up your title page. So page 1, hit it, center the alignment, hit enter a few times, and start the title page. You can go back to the APA format basics lesson in week 3 for a reminder of the title page requirements, the information and what goes on each line and what order it goes in. Then I want you to go to page 2 of your document, and you can either keep hitting enter or you can insert a page, right? Go to page 2, and on the first line of text, make sure you're still in center mode, and in bold type your title, right? Hit enter again, come down to the next line, take it out of centered and back to align left. That's where you'll start your introductory paragraph, but we're not going to do that quite yet. Next thing we're going to do is insert a page, go to page 3 and create your references page, right? Don't worry. We're going to create the references page on page 3 right now, but once you go back up to page 2 and start typing your introductory paragraph, and then all the rest of the paragraphs, that references page will continue to get moved down, right? But we're going to start on it right now. Page 3, centered and in bold on the first line of text, the word references, right? You'll hit enter again, take it out of bold, take it back to align left, and start your first reference entry. Remember the rules for formatting a references page. Again, you can go back to week 3 and look at the APA format basics lesson and the reference entries lesson, right? But create the references page right now before you write any of the essay whatsoever. Have the references page set. Then you go back to page 2, put your cursor on that second line of text, make sure you're not in bold, make sure you're not centered, should be in a line left, and start typing your essay. Now you've got the APA format elements in place. First thing you're going to type is your introductory paragraph. Remember that you need to start with a grabber. It needs to introduce your topic. The introductory paragraph needs to end with your thesis statement. You can go back to week 2 and read all about introductory paragraphs again. I will say, though, that if you think you are going to struggle, or if you find yourself struggling to create your introductory paragraph, even after you've gone back and reviewed that lesson in week 2, skip it. Skip it for now. type out your thesis statement, because you do at least have that. Type out your thesis statement and then move on. You can come back to that introductory paragraph at the very end if you need to, right? Don't let that create a block for you. Yes, it's gonna need to get created before you turn in the final draft, right? You could even hand me a rough draft that is just your thesis statement in the first paragraph. I don't suggest it. It's better if I see what you're trying to do in your intro besides just your thesis statement. But it is a rough draft. I'm not going to just give you a 0 and tell you to create that intro and then turn it back in. There are certain things that you can do wrong in your rough draft that will cause me to give you a 0 and say you need to fix these things first before I'll even look at it. The introductory paragraph alone is not one of them. Okay, so skip it if you need to. It could just be your thesis statement for now. But hopefully going back to the lessons in week 2 will give you some ideas for how to start that introductory paragraph, what kind of grabber you want to use. And I think a lot of the time, once students get the grabber, then the rest of the introductory paragraph starts to come a little easier to them. Okay, just don't forget, go back to week 2 if you need to. But don't let that be a block. You can just have your thesis statement for now and move on. Your body paragraphs. This is where most of the action occurs in your essay. So you want to make sure that you are doing a good job of developing your body paragraphs, right? Your body paragraphs they relate directly to your thesis statement. Every body paragraph should be discussing one of your main points in some way. They support your thesis statement with a very clear line of reasoning. You want to begin every body paragraph with a transitional topic sentence. If the paragraph is the beginning of a main point, then the transitional topic sentence should make clear where we are in the essay's organization, signal us that we're either about to discuss the first main point, or we're moving on to the second main point, or we're moving on to the next main point, the final main point, whatever the case may be. And it needs to clarify what main point it is as well. If the paragraph is a continuation of a main point, remember I said most of your main points should be dealing with complex ideas that require more than one paragraph to fully develop them. So you start main point 1 here, and your transitional topic sentence makes it clear that we are beginning to discuss your first main point, and that main point is this. But then you need another paragraph. The transitional topic sentence for this next paragraph should make it clear that we are continuing the discussion of this main point. We're just looking at a different aspect of that main point. You want reasoning and detailed evidence in these body paragraphs. This is where you elaborate on the transitional topic sentence. You provide your own ideas, then you provide information from a source, and then you follow up on that information and explain it and connect it to the main point you're making. Then you have a concluding sentence. So let's look here at a paragraph that comes from the middle of an essay. And you'll see, again, let's go back there, transitional topic sentence, right? Then you elaborate on that topic sentence with your own ideas. Then you provide information from your source with a citation, and then you follow up on that source, okay? Here in yellow is the transitional topic sentence. Another criticism that some people have of single-parent families centers on the belief that the only way for children to gain full emotional and behavioral skills is to be raised by both a mother and a father. In green is where they elaborate on that topic. When a topic such as this one has a broad number of variables, it is impossible to simply link these problems to only having one parent. Blue is the source material. In the article, Single-Parent Families Cause Juvenile Crime, author Robert L. McGinnis states, children from single-parent families are more likely to have behavior problems because they tend to lack economic security and adequate time with parents. Citation. Everything in pink here is the author of this essay explaining this source information and connecting it back to this idea. The simple statement that raw criminals are products of single-parent adolescence is absurd. What this writer, right, McGinnis, what this writer must understand is that it can be extremely difficult for one parent to raise a child by themselves for many reasons. A single parent must work full-time to be able to afford to provide for themselves and their child. They must also be able to still have time to offer an exuberant amount of emotional time for the well-being of their child. However, even though this may seem impossible, it can be done. So, transitional topic sentence, all in the author's own words, elaborating on that topic sentence. Again, author's original ideas and words. Then we use a source, cite it, and then we follow up on that source. We explain it and we connect it back to our main point. We're going to work on this more. This is just to show you a very simple version of what your paragraph should look like. It should always begin with a transitional topic sentence. It should always begin with your ideas and words. You're going to use a source in the paragraph, but a paragraph should never end with a citation, because if you use source information, you must always explain it and follow up on it. So a paragraph should never end with source information. It should always end with your ideas and words. So anything from a source should be found somewhere towards the middle of the paragraph, not at the beginning, not at the end. Okay. So, tips for using source material. I've kind of mentioned these a couple of times. First, make sure that you are using that specific source information for the right reason. That you've used information that will help deepen and develop a point. Or that the information is truly going to support your point, your thinking, to give credibility to it and to bring your point to life. But again, you do not want to just randomly pick a section of a source to include into your essay for the sake of it, just for the heck of it, just because you have to use sources. Use information that will actually help and make sense. Practice quotation restraint. Again, we're going to look at this in the next lesson a lot. You're going to want to use summary and paraphrase the most, which is the exact opposite of what most students try to do. They try to use nothing but direct quotes. Everything is direct quote from their sources. But you only want to use quotation if it is a key statement from an authority figure, or if it is so well worded that it just doesn't make sense to mess it up, or if it's a complex statement that really needs to be explained and unpacked, because you're going to have to, you don't want to mess up the wording. I don't think that's going to be the case for any of the topics that you guys have to choose from, though. So quite honestly, most of you can probably get by using 3 sources in your essay and never once using a direct quote. I bet you there will never be a time, maybe 10% of all students will find source information that really deserves a direct quote. 90% of all sources used by students on this project, 90% of them are not special enough to get a direct quote. They should all be summarized, or paraphrased. So please start thinking about that using a direct quote, taking something word for word from your source is probably, there's like a 90 to 95% chance that using the word for word direct quote isn't needed, that you should summarize or paraphrase. And again, we're going to look at how to do that in the next lesson. You also want smooth integration. You want to make sure that you're not plunking your quotes. You want to make sure that you are leading into the source material, that it's not like it just appears out of nowhere randomly and abruptly. Like, you lead us into the source material, you integrate it into your own line of thinking, you follow up on it. And again, we're going to cover that in the next lesson. But these are the things you want to think about when you're using source material in your body paragraphs. So again, it will make much more sense after you go through the next lesson. You'll be more prepared to do that as you draft and are working on your body paragraph. Okay. Make sure that you respect your sources, right? Think back to using sources and avoiding plagiarism. The most important step is respecting your sources is remembering to provide in-text citations every time you incorporate information from a source. You provide a citation every time, even if you use the same source a second or third time in the essay. Cite it every single time. You provide a citation no matter how you incorporate the source material. If you summarized something, it gets a citation. If you paraphrase something, it gets a citation. If you used a direct quote, word for word, it gets a citation every single time. Make sure that all of those citations match up with your reference entry for each source. Again, I covered this in week 4 in the kind of a combination of the reference entries lesson and the citations lesson. All right. But don't forget about those other source abuses that we learned about, right? So as you're looking at your body paragraphs, as you're writing them, and certainly as you're reviewing them before you submit the rough draft, make sure you're not using source information inaccurately. Represent that source factually. Make sure that you aren't using source information out of context. This first means that you have to fully understand what the source is saying. Because a lot of times students, out in the real world, information gets taken out of context and used all the time for manipulative, malicious reasons. Writing an academic essay, when sources get used out of context, when information gets used out of context, it's usually because the student didn't fully understand what the source was saying in the first place. Right? Make sure you aren't overusing source material, right? You don't want your paragraphs to look like a string of citations, right? Remember, 80% all you. Make sure you aren't plunking source material, especially direct quotes. There should be some sort of lead up to it. It shouldn't be where I'm reading your paragraph, your ideas, quote, your ideas. Where'd that quote come from? I was not prepared for it. I don't know why it's there. So don't plunk your quotes. Don't plunk any source information. It should be, you should always lead into it and integrate it and follow up on it. And again, we'll cover that in the next lesson. Make sure you don't use blanket citations, which means I should never read a paragraph and have a citation at the very end. If that citation is at the very end, what that tells me is the very last part of that paragraph came from that source. But if the information from this source is actually up here in the middle of the paragraph, I'm not going to know that because the citation has to come immediately after the source information. So your reader knows that's what came from this source. If you put it at the end of your paragraph, that tells me it's the end of your paragraph that came from this source. But you shouldn't have a citation at the end of your paragraph because we know If you use source information, you have to follow up on that information. So there should never be a citation at the end of your paragraph in the first place. But if there is, it tells me that that information came from that source that you've cited. So if the information is actually further up in your paragraph, I'm not going to know that. It's going to be wrong, and it's going to be plagiarism because you don't have a citation where it does need to be. So no blanket citation. And make sure you aren't relying too much on just one source, right? You need at least 3 in this essay. Try to use them equally as much as possible, okay? And that doesn't mean, if I see that you've used one of your sources 3 times and you've only used the other 2 sources 1 time each, that doesn't automatically mean you're relying too much on one source. It just depends on the situation. But just keep it in mind that you have 3 sources for a reason. You don't want one of them to be used over and over and over and over again, while the other 2 sources barely get used at all. Right? All right. Whew, a lot to think about with those body paragraphs, but again, that's the biggest chunk of your essay, so they require a lot of thought, a lot of reminders. But don't forget about your concluding paragraph. Go back to week 2 and review what a concluding paragraph needs to accomplish. Look at the examples that we discussed, and just remember that the whole concept of a concluding paragraph is to signal that the essay is ending, to remind your readers of your thesis statement. That does not mean restating the thesis word for word, just like it was in the intro. No, it is to remind your readers of their thesis statement. So remind them in some way of your focus topic, and remind them in some way of your main points, any big findings or, ideas that were discussed in the body of the essay, and then leave with a final thought, something you want us to think about, something you think needs to be done about your topic, right? So the 2 main things, though, are signaling that the essay is coming to a close and reminding your reader of the most important elements of what they just read. Then leave us with a final thought, right? Okay. Once you have written the draft, introductory paragraph to concluding paragraph, and you have incorporated your source material, then you want to review it and proofread it before you submit it, right? Hopefully you've been using an outline to help keep you on track, right? Help keep you organized, going in the order that you wanted. But, at the very least, check the draft to make sure that you have, followed the plan that you envisioned. Is everything in proper APA format? If you use my steps here in this lesson, then it should be, but check it. Does your introductory paragraph accomplish its 3 required tasks? All right. Do your body paragraphs accomplish their required tasks? Have you provided a citation every time you use information from a source? Do those citations match up to your reference entries on the references page? Remember, whatever the parentheses for your citation, the first element, it's often an author's last name because that's how the source begins on the references page. But if there's no author, then the reference entry will begin with something else. So whatever that something else is, that's what then shows up in the citation for that source. Remember how it matches up. Again, I covered this in great detail in week 4. Go back to that if you need to, for real. Does your concluding paragraph accomplish its required task? Have you proofread the draft? Now, proofreading means looking at smaller sentence level issues, grammar and mechanics, spelling, style. If this is not your strong suit, don't worry. Next week, week 6 is nothing but grammar and mechanics. So there will be a lesson on sentence fragments. There'll be a lesson on run-on sentences and comma splices. how to avoid ineffective writing, so more like stylistic things, making sure you're not being too wordy, making sure you're not using cliches, making sure you don't have a lot of inappropriate clutter, modifiers, sentence combining, right? So you will have an opportunity to go through those lessons for a refresher on sentence level issues before the rough draft is due, right? So the rough draft is due at the end of week 6, but the lessons in week 6 cover these sentence level issues. So just make sure that, you know, before you submit that rough draft at the end of the week, that you have, you know, checked your draft for all of those types of issues that we covered in the lesson, right? If you're content and confident in all of this, submit the rough draft and await my feedback. And my feedback will be super detailed. I am going to go to every single one of your sources that are listed on your references page. Well, first and foremost, I'm going to run the whole draft through a plagiarism checker. I do it for every single student, every single class. Run it through a plagiarism checker first. And assuming that that does not show me that a large percentage of your draft has been plagiarized, I will move on to the next step. But if the plagiarism checker comes back like 30, 40, 50% plagiarized, then you're going to get a 0 and told to redo it. But if it shows me a very low percentage, then my next step is to go to your references page and I pull up every single source. I read it. Some of them I don't really have to read anymore because the topic students tend to use a lot of the same sources from term to term, which is fine. But I go to every single source you list. I look it up, I read it, I learn about it, and then I go from there looking through the draft. And I'm very detailed with the feedback. So keep that in mind as you work on this rough draft. You have a lot to think about as you're doing the draft, but one thing that you don't want to forget is how seriously your instructor takes this and how much of a deep dive I do into each draft so that I can help you as much as possible. Okay. All right. That's it for this lesson. If you have questions, definitely reach out. I would maybe wait until after you go through the next lesson. Some questions might get answered in that next lesson on integrating sources, but certainly once you've gone through both lessons of the week, if you have questions or you need anything clarified, you need help with anything, definitely reach out. This is the time. You want to get those questions answered, get my advice, get anything you need before you have to write that rough draft next week. Okay? Guys, go ahead and free to move on.